Vern Nieporte was one of the brave and courageous from the 478th Engineer Battalion, U.S. Army Reserves, who helped unload bodies at the Fort Thomas Armory. Vern was a captain and was assisted by Battalion Communications Officer John Wost. Vern could smell the nightclub smoke from his house about a mile away. He got on his uniform and went to the Army Reserve Center and started fielding calls. Shortly after arriving, Vern volunteered the battalion's resources and other unit members started showing up. Vern said the process of moving the bodies was smooth because the armory was a huge area to lay the bodies for identification. As soon as the IDs took place, the bodies were moved to a refrigerated truck borrowed from Kroger's by one of the 478th troopers who worked there. Vern's year in Vietnam and training as an officer in the U.S. Army helped him to handle this type of mission. Vern made a detailed report to the battalion commander. During the evening's course of events, Vern received a call from the Pentagon and gave them an update on all of the events. The troopers and Vern were recognized by the Governor of Kentucky, Julian Carroll. Governor Carroll thanked the 478th Battalion for their efforts and made each reserve a Kentucky colonel. Moving bodies to the Fort Thomas Armory that became a temporary morgue was critical. The Fort Thomas Armory became a temporary morgue, and the 478th National Guard Battalion of Fort Thomas played a major role. During the major emergency disaster, they moved bodies from the Beverly site to the Fort Thomas Armory. Paul Sorg was a member of the Park Hills Life Squad. Living in Park Hills, Paul could see the Beverly nightclub smoke from his house. Paul felt horrible knowing his mother-in-law was working at this nightclub. When Paul got to the Beverly site, he was asked what he could do. He told those in charge that he was an EMT. He was sent to the chapel where he was asked to arrange bodies. Paul was a hospital corpsman in the Navy, and that helped him as an emergency responder. Paul left the site not knowing anything about his mother-in-law. When Paul returned to the fire station, he was told his mother-in-law made it out and was fine with some smoke damage to her lungs. Paul thinks of the fire today.
In those days before cell phones, emergency communications were dependent on radio operations. Amateur radio operators played an instrumental role in assisting emergency and disaster relief groups. Gary Johnston, K14LA, was one of those amateur radio operators who coordinated emergency radio communications during the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire. Mr. Johnston is a retired Northern Kentucky University professor. The idea of communicating wirelessly fascinated Gary when he was a youngster. Gary's father bought his son a crystal receiver when he was about 7, and Gary became hooked. Ham radio operators can assist in a variety of ways during a disaster. The incident commander, like a fire chief, will call in his assets. Hams can communicate with agencies like the Red Cross, FEMA, and the Salvation Army during emergency disasters. Hams train with those various agencies. Traffic can be about health and welfare, requests for manpower or equipment, interagency communications, or just about anything the agencies request. The entire operation at Beverly Hills was on various 2-meter repeaters and simplex. Gary's personal radio was a Regency HR-2B with a homebrew synthesizer. Gary used it as a base station for the operation from home. There was an almost immediate need for coordination between receiving hospitals. Families were sometimes separated, and with no cell phones and with landlines overloaded, they had no way to know where their loved ones had ended up. The Northern Kentucky Ham Group stationed operators at each hospital. When a call would come in, they would simultaneously check the admissions logs for the names. There was no HIPAA then. Then they would relay the location info back to the requester with one provision. No death or injury information was passed, only names and locations. While the operation was in progress, Gary learned of several friends who did not make it out alive, which was heartbreaking. Gary was devastated when he heard the names of fellow musicians who did not make it out. Hams were all traumatized by what they heard and saw that night. PTSD level traumatized. But as hams, they got on the air and met in restaurants and other gatherings to endlessly talk through the things they experienced. Starting in the 1990s, Gary served 11 years as an EMT. They were trained to have talk sessions with peers after traumatic events to avoid PTSD. They didn't know it back in the 1970s, but as it turned out, they were doing the right thing.